All right. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Patricia Major. And she is a historian and an author. She is currently the editor of the Michigan History Magazine. Perhaps you picked up a complimentary copy that she brought for us in the back that you're welcome to take home today. She has also been the assistant director and curator of the Michigan Women's Historical Center and Hall of Fame, which is in Lansing. And she has a bachelor's degree in journalism from Central Michigan University and a master's degree in historic preservation from EMU of Eastern Michigan. And so her book just came out in December.
About this time last year, I guess it was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So about a year ago, it's still relatively new. And let's join her for our talk today about women and housekeepers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Whoa. A little shorter. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to Troy Historic Village for inviting me. I understand this is quite an esteemed event. Your tea's at 2, and I'm just pleased to be involved. I'll be talking on this subject, which is a subject of a book that I wrote last year, as Ann mentioned, and the books will be available afterwards for sale. They're $20 a piece. I got a little bit of a break from the publisher by selling them direct like this. So if you're interested, they'll be over there at the end. But in the meantime, I do hope you all picked up a copy of Michigan History Magazine and also this brochure from the Michigan Women's Historical Center, because I'll be talking about that. And they'll be back there too later. Let me tell you a little bit about how I came to write a book on this subject. It's my first book, hopefully not my last, but I was the curator at the Michigan Women's Historical Center in Lansing. And that, if you haven't been there to visit, it's the only museum in Michigan that's dedicated to women's history. And every 6 months I had to come up with an exhibit idea that related to something significant that Michigan women had done. And I saw an article, interestingly, in Michigan History Magazine about a woman who was a lighthouse keeper. And that was surprising enough because I didn't know women had held that position. But inside the article was a table of 50 names, 50 other women who had done the same thing. So that had stuck in my mind, and I thought, maybe that would be a good subject for an exhibit. As I said, there were 50 plus women who held this position, and that's the largest number of females who were employed as lighthouse keepers in the nation. Michigan happens to be the state with the most lighthouses in the nation, so I think there's a correlation there. And so I developed this exhibit, which was there for 6 months, and now it tours around. You might have seen it at a museum or a library around the state. Still going strong. So with that much interest in the subject, I thought perhaps I could expand it into a book, and contacted a publisher, and they said we'd be interested. So I did, and now I have a book. Let me give you a little bit of chronology to place these lighthouse keepers in their proper context in time, so you know how far back lighthouse keeping goes and how far back women as lighthouse keepers go. The very first lighthouse keeper in the U.S. was named George Worthylake, and he served in Boston Harbor at Little Brewster Island. That was the first federally sanctioned lighthouse in the nation. That's not to say there weren't other things that served as lighthouses up to that point, but that was the first time the federal government got into it as something that they would control and monitor. So back in 1716, the first man to serve as a lighthouse keeper in the U.S., the first woman also in the 18th century. Her name was Hannah Thomas, and she served in Massachusetts as well. She served north of there at a place called Gurnett Point. And her husband was actually the lighthouse keeper there initially, but he was called away to serve in the Revolutionary War. So she stepped in for him, and he ended up dying of smallpox during the war. So she was formally named his replacement and served for 15 years. So that was a good long term for anyone in the lighthouse service, let alone someone who was a real groundbreaker, in this case, first woman. On the Great Lakes, the first woman to serve as a keeper was in Ohio at Marblehead. If you've seen Ohio license plate, it has a lighthouse on it. That's the Marblehead Lights up near Cedar Point. And Rachel Wolcott was there with her husband. Again, he was the lighthouse keeper. He died when a cholera epidemic swept through that part of Ohio. And so she took over for him and served for 2 years until she remarried, and then her second husband became the keeper. So she had a 2-year term of service. And then here in Michigan, our first keeper was Catherine Shook, and she served at Point O'Bark Lighthouse. That's up in the tip of the thumb. Right as ships would enter Saginaw Bay. It was kind of a treacherous point. She, like the other two women, took over from a husband that died while in the service. We'll hear a little bit more about her. She's pretty special. And let me give you a sense of the difference between women and men in this profession. Some things were the same and some things were radically different between the two genders. The method of appointment is one of those things that was different. Men typically became lighthouse keepers in a number of ways. Perhaps they were already a mariner. They might have received their appointment as almost a compensation for a Civil War injury, or a number of disabled Civil War veterans who were lighthouse keepers. They might have been in the right political party, and when the jobs were being given out, they were in line. So that's generally how men got into lighthouse keeping, and also perhaps they succeeded a previous generation in their own family, or a number of families of keepers. The women generally, as was noted on the previous slide, the women generally assumed their position as a result of their husband dying. And so they were there. It was actually a policy as early as the 1830s that women would succeed their deceased husbands because they were thought to be, knowledgeable. They probably helped him, and better to go with someone you know and trust than try and bring in someone new and train them. The way that women would come into that position was if their husbands were away at war, Civil War, and Spanish-American War. Uniform requirements was another area in which women and men had different rules. The men, if you've ever visited a lighthouse that's been restored and reopened, typically the men would wear a navy blue suit, double-breasted jacket, navy blue cap, and that was their formal uniform, obviously. The women had no uniform, formal or informal, that was specified by the lighthouse service. But as most women served in the last quarter of the 19th century, the fashions of that time would just dictate that they were wearing a long skirt, a long dress, maybe high-heeled boots. Really not the kind of outfit that would be safe in a situation, especially climbing stairs and carrying oil and lighting lamps. But that was the fashion of the day, and that's what the women wore. Women were also not allowed to serve at isolated lighthouses, particularly island lighthouses, for their own safety. And of course, this was before any form of communications that they could have used to alert authorities that they were in danger. They also did not serve on light ships, which were floating lighthouses, really a ship that was moored in a point over a dangerous reef. Those usually had crews of 4 or 5 men, and it was just thought that would not be a good idea to place a woman in that environment either. Women typically didn't manage male assistants, but there are 2 exceptions that I'll talk about later. But that was usually left to men to do. And their list of responsibilities was the same with one exception. They had to do all the cleaning, they had to do all the keeping of the logbook, they obviously had to light the lamp and extinguish it every morning. They had to do all of the physical labor that the men did, except if they happened to serve at a lighthouse that was painted on the outside. If you think of a conical tower, that was usually done by lowering the painter down the side of the lighthouse on a bosun's chair, which is a kind of an open chair that hangs from pulleys, and that was thought to be unladylike. So they were relieved of that one responsibility. So they probably, you know, someone from the lighthouse service visiting them with their supplies probably did that, or they hired it out. And then salary was the other area in which women surprisingly were paid exactly the same as men. Yeah, nobody made a fortune working for the lighthouse service, but women made exactly the same as men. Catherine Shook, our first female lighthouse keeper, she made $300 a year. Her husband made that, and the man after her made that. So it's kind of interesting that they did not make a distinction in the federal pay scale to make a difference there. They just paid everybody the same thing. Let me read to you, just in case you're not familiar with the duties of a lighthouse keeper, let me read you a little bit from my book that describes what they had to do. And this is actually from an 1835 document from the lighthouse service. You are to light the lamps every evening at sunsetting and keep them continually burning bright and clear till sun rising. You are to be careful that the lamps and reflectors and lanterns are constantly kept clean and in order, and be careful that no lamps, wood, or candles be left burning anywhere so as to endanger fire. In order to maintain the greatest degree of light during the night, the wicks are to be trimmed every 4 hours, taking care that they are exactly even on top. You are to keep an exact accounting of the quantity of oil received from time to time. And there was a period where the lights were lit by, in simple terms, essentially the hurricane lamp reflected through a prism. So that was a dangerous business, obviously, but then they did switch to electricity in the 1920s. So then here are some of the other things that they had to do. Keeping a lamp lit when the wind was gusting or a storm was raging could prove quite a challenge. In foggy weather, early keepers were also responsible for stoking the coal-burning boilers that powered their fog signals, sometimes day and night. At daybreak, keepers would extinguish their lamps, close the curtains in the lantern, and turn their attention toward record keeping. That would be recording the weather or ship sightings, other details in the logbook. And they had to maintain the lighthouse's structures and equipment. And this was a critical part of their work because the stations were inspected periodically, and you could be penalized or even removed if you did not keep it up to their standards. So hard physical work for either gender. Here are some statistics that relate just to the women in Michigan, the 50 plus. They served from the very first person, Catherine Shook, to the last person. There was a span of 105 years over the 19th and 20th centuries. And there are 52 known female lighthouse keepers and assistant keepers. And I underscore known there because sometimes the lighthouse service records are written by hand, as census records are a little difficult to decipher. Sometimes names are only expressed in initials, or there might be a name that can go both ways, male, female. So 52 known, more than any other state in the Union, as I said. And they served at 42 different lighthouses throughout the three of the Great Lakes in this area, Michigan, Superior, and Huron, as well as the Detroit River. Although there was a lighthouse in Lake Erie that was in Michigan waters, no women served at it. And I'm only talking, of course, here about Michigan women. There were women who certainly served in Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ontario, on the other sides of the Great Lakes. Michigan women served an average of 5.5 years and some as much as 10 years. As I mentioned, most of them succeeded a deceased husband or served during a period when they were at war. And several females were part of lighthouse keeping families. Like the three of those families come to mind, one each in Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, and Lake Huron. In Lake Michigan, a family named Sheridan had multiple generations who served. In Lake Superior, the Corgans, C-O-R-G-A-N. And in Lake Huron, the Garrity family, sometimes spelled with two A's, sometimes G-A-R-R-I-T-Y. And those families all had women keepers within them. The first lady that I'll focus on today, and I'll just, focus on about 6 or 7, is Catherine Shook. Obviously, our first lady of the light in a number of ways. She served at Point O'Bark at the tip of the thumb, and she and her husband had moved there in 1848. That's just 11 years after statehood, to what was really a remote area that can only be reached by water. They had 8 children. And she had taken ill one day, and her husband traveled by boat down to Port Huron to secure the services of a physician. And that doctor came back with 2 men of his own, and so there were 4 men in the boat on the way back. She was treated. The doctor felt comfortable leaving her, and the 4 men got back in the boat with Peter, the husband, because he wanted to get some supplies. Unfortunately, they capsized around Lexington and all perished in that accident. So you can only imagine in 1848 how long it took, or this would be 1849 at this point, how long it took for her to be notified of this. I mean, how long did she wait, wondering where he was? Finally, she was notified, and because it was such a remote posting and she was in dire need of doing something to support her family, they agreed that she could stay on as the keeper. And she did for 2 years, but it couldn't have been easy. In fact, within the first year that she served, the keeper's cottage caught on fire. And it turns out that it was a malfunction in the way that the chimney was constructed, but still it put her and her children out. They had to erect a lean-to until the lighthouse service could send someone out to rebuild the cottage. And because she was a woman, she wasn't even allowed to sign for the materials. Her oldest son had to sign as the man of the house, the man of the cottage. So she served until 1851, 2 years. And she, because they had so many children, and those children had children and ad infinitum, she has descendants all around central Michigan. And I usually, at my talks, I usually come across another new one that I've not met before. So she and her husband left quite a legacy in Michigan. We don't have a picture of her, too early. This is Anna Garrity of one of those lighthouse keeping families. Anna and her mother Mary were the only known Michigan lighthouse keepers, females, to be related, mother and daughter and mother. And their family tended to serve up between Rogers City and Alpena at the Presque Isle lights. And there's a series of them out there. There's an old Presque Isle, there's a new Presque Isle, Presque Isle range lights. And so it was the father, the mother, 3 sons and a daughter that were all keepers in one way or another in those lights. And Anna was our second longest serving Lady of the Light at 23 years. She served at the range lights. This is, I call her our persevering Lady of the Light because she had some difficulties with the lighthouse service, but continued to do her duty. Her name is Julia Braun, and she served at the opening of the Saginaw River as it empties into Saginaw Bay. And her husband was one of those Civil War veterans who had been disabled in the war, was given the lighthouse appointment as compensation, but really could not handle the physical duties. So long before she was named keeper, she was doing the job. And when he ultimately died, then she was formally given the job and the pay for that. And during her term, she oversaw the construction of the current lighthouse, which is a brick lighthouse. And she served with some assistance from a young son a teenage son that she had, until she remarried. She married a man named George Way, who was a pilot, which is essentially a person who would guide ships up and down the Saginaw River through the shoals. And when she married him, immediately she was removed from her position and he got her position. But at least she was allowed to assist him, so they had 2 paychecks coming in. But then in 1882, they abolished her position entirely with, rather abruptly. And on that same day, they abolished Mary Garrity's position. She was assisting her husband at Presque Isle. So I kind of wonder if there was some sort of memo that went out that, we want to cut back on the women. And then the position was reopened a couple of months later and filled with a man. Now, she probably looks a little severe to you, and this is a picture from later in her life. I don't have anything from her as a younger woman, but the few situations where I've seen kind of before and after photos, before they became a keeper and after, there is a striking difference in these women. I mean, it was a hard job, and certainly none of them were heavy at the end of their careers, and many of them do have this sort of gaunt look to their face and neck, and they came in as sort of plump-cheeked young women, and they left looking a little different. This is our longest serving Lady of the Light in Michigan. Her maiden name was Elizabeth Whitney, and she married a man named Clement Van Riper. And he died, unfortunately, while trying to save some people from a shipwreck that had occurred in Beaver Island Harbor, where their lighthouse was. She took over for him, and she stayed there for 12 years after that. Then she remarried a man named Williams, Daniel Williams. So now most people regard her as Elizabeth Whitney Williams, and requested a transfer to the mainland, where they had just completed a new lighthouse in the Harbor Springs area called Little Traverse, because that's the bay it's on. And she was given that, and that was really an honor to be given a new lighthouse that no one had served at. So she served there for another 29 years. And she's, not only is she our longest serving female lighthouse keeper, but she's our best known. She's really the rock star of Michigan female lighthouse keepers. She wrote an autobiography of her, not just of her lighthouse keeping career, but of her life, called A Child of the Sea, which I would highly recommend. You can usually get it from, they've reprinted it, and you can also get it in the original version. She's been the subject of books. There's a really cute children's book about her that's out, and she's, if any of you have read the book Women Who Kept the Lights, which is about the national picture of female lighthouse keepers, she has her own chapter in that. She's pretty well known, and deservedly so. I mean, she served a good long time, and 41 years, which is a striking number for any profession, was not the longest on the Great Lakes, not the longest serving female. That honor went to a woman in Indiana, Michigan City, Indiana, Harriet Colfax, who served 43 years. And that's not even the national record. There was a woman in Biloxi, Mississippi, who served for 51 years. So, some people are just really drawn to this profession, and as long as they let them serve, they served. She also had a penchant for writing poetry, and in her autobiography are poems that she kind of intersperses through the pages. Let me read a little bit of one which is about lighthouse keeping. Let our lamps be brightly burning for our brothers out at sea. Then their ships are soon returning. Oh, how glad our hearts will be. There are many that have left us. Never more will they return. Left our hearts with sorrows aching. Still our lamps must brightly burn. She's very dedicated to her craft. We have some ladies of the lights who really weren't very excited about being called upon to participate in lighthouse keeping. They were substituting for husbands who left for one reason or another. And one of these is Lucy Gramer. She was married to the Ecorse Range lighthouse keeper, Gus Gramer. This would be downriver, down Detroit River. And he was quite a character from all accounts that I've read. He had been a sailor, had been on a whaling ship, had been shipwrecked, and finally took this position as a lighthouse keeper, which I think just did not suit him as a person with wanderlust. So when the Spanish-American War came along, he decided he was going to leave her in charge of the lighthouse and go off and fight that. Unfortunately, it was during the same month when she had bore a child, so that must have been a little difficult. And it just made for a rocky marriage, and she apparently had talked to him about divorce. And he took his case to one of the Detroit newspapers, which was probably not a good move on his part. But here's what he had to say. This is a quote from the Detroit Tribune. Gus called upon his wife the other night and urged her to come back with the children and live with him. But she demurred, and after acknowledging how good he had been to her, she fell on her knees, Gus says, and between her sobs confessed that she really preferred a former roomer of the Gramers, although he is not as handsome. And the end quote. Gramer then claimed to have called his old friend in, made the man kneel beside his wife, and placed Lucy's hand in that of the other person. Lucy, he is reported to have said, "Be good to the children. Charlie, be good to Lucy, as she has been a good wife to me." He told the reporter that he concluded the meeting by taking Lucy and Charlie out to an ice cream parlor. Unfortunately for Gus, Mrs. Gramer disputed his account, particularly the part about her falling on her knees. So she contacted the newspaper, and this is what she said. If Gus was half as good as Charlie, it would be better for him, and there would probably have never been any trouble. When he says that I'm going to marry another man as soon as I get a divorce, he is drawing on his imagination. There is no truth in it, and I never fell down on my knees to Gus and confessed anything. Everybody knows that I am full of the old Nick, but everybody except Gus knows that it is all honest fun and no meanness, and Gus ought to know that too. End quote. Though Gus had agreed to give Lucy custody of their children, she apparently didn't trust him to keep his word. She told the paper that she was going to, quote, keep a sharp lookout, end quote, to see that he didn't get any legal advantage when she was not looking. Gus maintained his keeping position at Ecorse through the divorce proceedings and quickly married again, this time to a woman named Mary. Her name appears as an acting keeper at Ecorse in 1906, so apparently he took off again. I've seen pictures of him, and he just looks like a character. He's got kind of a Yosemite Sam mustache, and this looks kind of wild. But this was our last Lady of the Light. She served in the 20th century in the 40s and 50s, which actually was long after any other female had stopped serving. Anna Garrity served in the 1920s. But Frances married married a man named Leo Worry, and she became his assistant at White River, and that is between Ludington and Muskegon. And they also had a rocky marriage. And they divorced and went their own ways, and both left the lighthouse service, which at that point was the Coast Guard, taken over by the Coast Guard. But within a year, she had missed it so much that she petitioned to return as principal keeper to that same light, and the Coast Guard agreed. And she's the only woman to have served during the Coast Guard period, which started in 1939. She served at a light that was not a major light by any means. Basically, it lit the way to a channel between Lake Michigan and White Lake. So it was for pleasure boats. So there wasn't a lot of shipwreck activity in that area. But what she did have to deal with were the tourists who came to stay at hotels along Lake Michigan who didn't know how to swim in Lake Michigan or understand that the riptides could be very dangerous. And so she would be, cleaning up in the lighthouse and hear or see someone struggling in the lake and come tearing down the steps and out across the sand and jump into the water and save them. And she did this many times, and adults and children. And in one case, when she was trying to save an adult woman who was a bit on the hefty side, the woman was panicked and she was flailing and really making it harder than it needed to be. And so Frances socked her in the jaw, and that stopped her, enough for Frances to get them both to shore. So it just was a kind of a quirky story in her past, but I had the opportunity to interview her in 2008. And she was just she was also a character, but in a good way, not like Gus. And she, one of those people who kind of told it like it was. And when I asked her about how she and Leo, her first husband, worked together at the lighthouse, this is what she said. I asked, "You were Leo's assistant when you married? You assisted him?" And she said, "Assisted him? He didn't do anything." He was dead by then when she said this, but still. "He liked to fish and hunt and stuff like that. That's what he did. He found out he could do that and I could do all the work. Gads. I had to, the floors were all wooden floors, hardwood. I had to scrub them and then wax them and then polish that. I did all the dishes and kept the house. And gads, then I had to keep the light clean every day too." So she was quite a wonderful person. Among the ladies of the lights, there were some tragic tales. This is a picture of Julia Sheridan of the Lake Michigan Sheridan family. And she assisted her husband at South Manitou Island. And that was a pretty remote lighthouse there. And for, I don't know what reason, but in March, they got into a sailboat to sail to the mainland. It would seem to be a treacherous time of the year to be sailing. And sure enough, the boat capsized, and she, her husband, and her youngest child all perished in that. There was, however, one person who survived, the owner of the boat. But again, one of those situations where how long did it take for her other 5 children who were on the island to be notified what had happened to their family. Surprisingly, one of those children became a lighthouse keeper, so that didn't deter him, but a very sad story. And then Mary Terry's body, Mary Terry that I had mentioned early on, her story is what inspired me to think about this as a subject to do an exhibit and then a book about. Mary Terry was a lighthouse keeper at Sandpoint, Escanaba, and that was a wooden lighthouse. And she was known to have a little money set aside, and she owned some properties in Escanaba. And one night, her lighthouse just went up in flames, and before anybody realized it, it was, really ashes, and her body was burned to a point where they couldn't determine the cause of death. But there is, even today, there's some speculation that she was robbed, and the fire set to cover up that crime. But so she obviously met an unfortunate end in the lighthouse service. And then Anna Garrity, we saw a picture of her earlier. She was actually assaulted as a young teen by one of her father's assistant keepers. And each principal keeper had to keep a logbook, as I mentioned earlier, of comings and goings of ships and activities, the weather, and that sort of thing. And it was usually written in a very straightforward way, almost telegraphic, not even complete sentences. And this is what her father wrote on the day that he discovered that she had been assaulted. Quote, "My assistant is now in the county jail. The sheriff arrested him with a criminal warrant for the crime of rape on my daughter Annie and threatened her life and tried to choke her. He obtained a hearing before a justice and was bound over to the term of circuit court, which will be in October next," end quote. Following journalistic practice of the day, Anna was named in a newspaper report of the assistant's arraignment. The Presque Isle County Advance described her as a beautiful young lady of about 17 summers who comes from a most highly respected family. The assistant was later tried for his crime in nearby Rogers City, but the results of that trial are unknown due to a fire that destroyed all accounts from that period. Lighthouse service records show, however, that the assistant was removed from his position that year. So it's kind of amazing that, that occurring at the age of 17, she still went on later in her life to be a part of the lighthouse service, served for 23 years. There are also some triumphant stories in the lighthouse, Ladies of the Lights. Anastasia Truckee, that's who's pictured here, sometimes called Eliza. Her husband went off to fight in the Civil War and left her for 3 years in Marquette Harbor lighthouse, to take over for him. And that was a very critical time for that particular lighthouse, because the iron ore that was coming out of the mines in nearby Ishpeming and Negaunee came filtering through to Marquette, to the harbor, to be placed onto ships, which sailed for foundries where they could make things like rails or barrels for guns or iron cladding for ships. So it was really a very important pivotal role of a lighthouse keeper in the Civil War, that she managed to keep the light lit and ensure there were no shipwrecks during the time of that period that she served. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth Van Riper Williams, or Elizabeth Whitney Williams, was the first keeper at a new light at Little Traverse. And then there were 2 women who did manage male assistants. One was Anna Garrity, and the other one was Jane Enos. She served at St. Joseph Light in our far southwestern corner. And she managed at one point her son-in-law, and at another point another man. And there were a number, as was common at the time, there were a number of women who succeeded to lighthouse keeping who had large families. Mary Corrigan from the Lake Superior Corrigans gave birth in the lighthouse boat while on Lake Superior. She was actually trying to get to the doctor. She and her husband, I think at that time, were serving at Gull Rock, which is a very small island that was literally just a rock and a lighthouse on it. And they had to get to the mainland for any kind of medical services. So again, in the logbook, this is what her husband recorded as what happened on that boat. He was the principal keeper, she was the assistant. Principal keeper started 8 p.m. in the station boat with wife for Copper Harbor, distant 14 miles, with anticipation of increase soon after arriving. When 1.5 miles east of Horseshoe Harbor, Mrs. Corrigan gave birth to a rollicking boy. All things lovely, had everything comfortable aboard. The sea was a dead calm. End quote. After the child was delivered, there was no need to seek help in Copper Harbor, so the craft was turned about and arrived back at the lighthouse. And with its new resident, which his parents named James. And Mary had 8 children, one of them became a lighthouse keeper. And then in Squaw Point, which doesn't exist anymore but was near Escanaba, there was a keeper named Catherine Marvin. She succeeded a deceased husband. And prior to being a lighthouse keeper, she had 10 children. And by the time she became the keeper, 4 were still at home. But there were many others who had 6 to 8 children. So this is, quite a responsibility, juggling a very large family by yourself as a widow with your lighthouse keeping duties. In terms of second acts, there weren't too many people like Elizabeth Whitney Williams who served so long. So these women, it wasn't their life's calling in most cases. And we know a little bit about a few of the women, what they did after they were keepers. This is a photograph of Carolyn Lidigot Antaya. And Lidigot was her first married name. She married Barney Lidigot, who was an uncle of Henry Ford. And Barney was a disabled Civil War veteran, and he died soon after he took over lighthouse keeping duties at Mama Judah Lighthouse in the Detroit River. So Caroline took over for him, was formally appointed. But after a few years, she had ended up meeting someone, which is kind of hard to believe you could do that on a lighthouse in the river, but she met someone. He lived in Port Huron, though, where he operated a fishery. And so they married, but they lived separate. And then she had a daughter by him, and then after that decided, that's it. I'm closing down shop here at the lighthouse. I'm going to move up to Port Huron. So we know that she started a second family and moved away. Frances Worry Johnson, our last lady lighthouse keeper, started an entirely different career. She would have stayed longer at her lighthouse, but she also got married again, and that marriage failed, and she had a toddler, and she just didn't feel she could handle the responsibilities. So she quit there and went to work in the area, in Montague, Whitehall area, as an office manager, and she retired from that 30 years after that, because she was only in her 30s when she left the lighthouse. And then, so many others remarried, and we really can't, as genealogists lament, we cannot trace what happened to these women because we don't know their last names, their new last names. So unfortunately, many of their stories were really lost in time. Frances, that I mentioned, died this year. She was in her late 80s, and I kept in touch with her after I interviewed her, gave her a copy of the book, and she was unique, obviously, in being the last lady lighthouse keeper, but the fact that she was one at all is unique. And but her claim to fame, as she saw her life, was that she appeared on What's My Line? Yeah. Was sort of in the middle of her tenure as a keeper, and she got a call from the people, scheduling the talent at the show, and asked if she wanted to come over. She took a train across Michigan, across part of Canada, into New York State, and they put her up for a couple of days, and she really did the town up right. But they never did figure out what she was. The panel didn't figure it out. They thought she had something to do with the cereal industry in Michigan. That was about as close as they got. So she was so pleased that she stumped them. And when I visited her for the interview, she had a huge, almost half the size of this, a huge billboard or bulletin board in which she had all sorts of memorabilia from this trip. Tickets to a Broadway show that she went to, photograph of her with the panel, all of that. And that was what she thought was the most distinctive thing in her life. And, I did kind of gently prod her to hoping that she'd understand that how unique she was in other ways. And at the end of my interview with her, which is reproduced in the book, I asked, "Do you think of yourself as a pioneer?" And she says, "No, not really," with a laugh. And I say, "Because you were." And she said, "Well, I sure enjoyed it, whatever I was." So that's my presentation, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have about ladies. I obviously only told you about a few of them, but any questions that come to mind? Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the Lighthouse Service, and I'm wondering what part of the government it was under?
Initially, it was under the Treasury. It was under the Treasury. And now, the Coast Guard is under transportation, interestingly, unless it's time of war, in which case it comes under the Navy.
The lighthouse is still manned?
Nope. And this is true nationwide. There are no lighthouses that are staffed anymore, except for with volunteers, but they're not serving, obviously, the life-saving function that the original lighthouse keepers were. The last woman to serve, obviously, was Frances, who ended her tenure in 1954. The last Michigan man was in 1983 at Point Betsy on Lake Michigan. So there's a 30-year difference between the men and the women in Michigan. And all the lighthouses that are still used as aids to navigation are owned by the Coast Guard, maintained by the Coast Guard. But generally, there are thankfully many, many volunteer groups that have now adopted many of these lighthouses and actually, outright purchased the ones that don't have a function as an aid anymore. Thank God.
Some are private homes.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And also there is a unique bed and breakfast, I believe, in the UP that is a lighthouse.
Yep, there are a couple. Yep, you can stay. There's one way over by Ontonagon whose name is Sand Hills, Big Bay, and you can stay, in various places like that. The Whitefish Point. Mm-hmm.
Did you come across anything about them being haunted?
I did not. Mm-hmm. I understand one of the Presqu'île lights is haunted, and I did go to Presqu'île.
Old Presqu'île.
Old Presqu'île.
That's the old lighthouse keeper who died.
Mhm.
His wife still lives in the little house and sells trinkets and stuff, and all the stories that go around with it.
Yeah. And some say White River, where Francis served, is also haunted by a happy ghost, not a mean ghost, of one of its previous keepers prior to Francis. Mm-hmm.
Do you still travel to these lighthouses and get to speak to the people that live there?
Not to those who live there, because at this point we're, even the children are aged. So I haven't done that in terms of my research. But I have been going to speak at these lighthouses, kind of on my book tour. And 2 weekends ago, I was up at Big Sable, which is just north of Ludington. And that volunteer group controls 4 different lighthouses along Lake Michigan. And I got to stay in the keeper's cottage. It was so exciting. So quiet, beautiful. Sometimes people ask how children were schooled at lighthouses. There were actually boxes that had doors that were filled with books that were circulated from lighthouse to lighthouse by the service when they would come and resupply a lighthouse. And those boxes often contained things like the Bible, geography books, literature, poems, science books, maps, and they were really kind of the homeschooling tools of those lighthouse keepers whose lights were too isolated to allow their children to attend regular schools. So. Anything else? Well, as I mentioned, I'm happy to sign books over here. Thank you.